Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. See you in a second. All right, Dr. Kastner's trying to get in now. I think he's having a little bit of trouble, but he should be just a few seconds. Now, are you all having the storm issues that other places in the Midwest are having?
We aren't currently, but we are currently live. So
We are,
Okay.
we are live now.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brandy. It's your meeting, girl.
Okay, I'm pulling up board docs. Okay, something's not working right. Okay, there we go. All right, I'd like to call this board work session to order May 5th, 2022 at approximately 6:34 p.m. Can I get an approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries. Admin Communications, COVID-19 update. Dr. Jameson.
all right. Good evening, everyone. I am still continuing to give our COVID-19 updates and just want to remind our community that we are still in a pandemic. While I recognize that we've rolled back some of our mitigation measures, we are continuing to track the data to determine whether or not we need to reinstitute some of our measures or if we need to make additional adjustments. And so as stated before, the COVID data from the St. Louis County is being reported differently. And so the data now currently comes out weekly, and a lot of the data that we're used to seeing as far as the transmission rates and positivity rate is not necessarily being reported. But I will share that when our COVID task force meeting called this week, we discussed changes to the dashboard because they are trying to find the best way to continue to share some of that data, but also to keep the community informed outside of the community rates. So what you see before you, and I'll continue to share this on a weekly basis, and as we add additional weeks, the weeks prior will roll off. But our COVID inpatient bed utilization has a decline from the previous week. But from the call today, we talked about really the students that are being hospitalized are not students. And so it's usually those who are immune compromised or those who are elderly. And so I wanted to share that information because sometimes with the way that they're reporting the data, because they do not include the age range, the data that's being reflected can be misleading. You can see there too with the COVID hospital admissions, same information was shared today as well. And then you can see a case decline for the cases per 100,000 for those patients. As mentioned before, the community level for our region, which is St. Louis County, continues to be low. And again, part of the conversation that we had today during the COVID meeting was really situated around how that information can also still be misleading. So while the community level could be low, we still could see transmission within the community and also have high positivity rates depending on the zip code that you actually reside in. But currently, as it relates to how we're reporting data given to us through St. Louis County Department of Health, we have a low community level. So I will continue to share and track the zip code data. I think it's important for us to do that. Not sure just what happened there, but I will continue. And so while our current COVID data that's being reported, let's see if I can get this back up. For the zip code, actually there's a increase, and with that increase, we're seeing a slight increase in our school data, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And we're seeing that increase actually taking place in the elementary school, and we are continuing to see that data remain steady for our other school campus sites. Get back to that. So again, here's our zip code data. The new cases in the past 14 days, we're at 35 for our zip code of 63117. And that is actually an increase in about 15 cases from the previous report that was provided to the board 2 weeks ago. Same as said for the zip code of 63143. And so I think this information is important because while St. Louis County is showing the community rate, this helps us to see where our cases are for COVID within our community, which is important as we think about how it impacts us at the school level. As reported, this is the new dashboard. This information is continuously updated. And I like that it's actually disaggregated by the school sites, keeping in mind that for our threshold, which was set at 1%, the middle and high school are combined because it's a shared campus. Right now, the elementary school is currently masked. They will actually have some individuals who will roll off the count for positivity rate, and then they will transition into unmasked for the upcoming weeks. And I'll have Vince Estrada to share a little bit about the data that he's received once we get to the point to talk about vaccination rates. Continuing to track our data to look at our sites. And I will say that while the ECC continues to reflect higher numbers for the cumulative positive cases, it is not the case because right now we're seeing that from previous with the Delta and Omicron variant, but the elementary school is where we're seeing the decrease. Showing the vaccination rates, and this is the part that I'm really excited about. And when we get to the next slide, I'll have Vince to share a little bit about what he's seen. So right now you can see where we are for St. Louis County. The percentage for fully vaccinated community members is about 72% for those individuals who are up to the age of 18. And I actually capped it at 18 because we're looking at our school age students, which is at 72%. And when I pulled the vaccination rates, and you can see the date for April 29th, this is where our vaccination rates actually were sitting during that time. And the middle school was at 82%. And you can see the rest of where our population is currently. And so I am going to pause and yield the floor to Vince Estrada so that he can give an update on our vaccination rates and some of the trends that he's seeing as he's working with the nurses to continue to track our positive cases within our school communities, as well as our vaccination rates. Mr. Estrada?
Hey, good evening, everybody. Good evening, MRH. Dr. Jameson, since you're doing such a good job sharing your screen, if you're able to access the district website and pull up that COVID-19 screen, because we just posted some new numbers today on May 5th. And while you're doing that, I'll tell the group. So one of the things that one of our working hypotheses on the vaccination rate was that we just didn't have all the data on our students that were fully vaccinated. And we were able to gain access to Show Me Vax. And I want to give publicly thank Michelle Davis, who's our ECC nurse, who actually did go through the 3rd and 4th, 5th grade rosters to look to see if she could find any vaccination information. She found a lot. You know, Nurse Catherine's on maternity leave, so she picked up the slack and took care of the elementary school. So they jumped from about 58%. So first of all, going to our building rates, this is as of today. And so we're at 0.67, 0.60, 0.41% at all the buildings. Oh, went away. Oh,
Sorry about that.
that's okay. So we're kind of hovering, we're in a safe zone right now. We're below 1%. And so we are going to go mask recommended at the elementary school starting tomorrow. But our vaccination rates are exciting. And I also did some national research looking at the American Academy of Pediatrics. So if you want to scroll down, Dr. Jameson, I was a little bit excited about it. So our overall, I'm so excited about this. So our district student rate for eligible students is 71.48%, which is fantastic. The last data that we're going to mine is our 9th through 12th grade. Angel's going to work on that in the coming week. Angel Goldberg, our outstanding high school, middle school nurse. So I would anticipate that the high school number is going to jump into the 70s. And I think I would anticipate we're going to settle with students in the mid 70s, which feels really good to me. we did add a new line at the bottom. I thought it'd be interesting to look at our cumulative community, both in kind of adding in our staff members as well as our students. So our overall vaccination rate between staff and students is 75.3% as of today. So those are really encouraging numbers and kind of where I thought we might be, honestly. So with Dr. Jameson's regular encouragement, we keep looking for those numbers and we're finding them, and that feels really good. And I want to thank the families and for working collaboratively with us and to keep us safe and to kind of allow us to keep the schools open safely. So I wanted to share that information with you. I would anticipate those numbers will continue to go up once we get done looking at the high school numbers. And then I think we'll kind of be at a peak. So good news, and I wanted to share it with you. I did see that according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I dropped this in the board notes, the vaccination rate nationally for school-age kids is about 48%, and we're at 71%. So that feels great. And the fully vaccination rate for all persons that are eligible, adults and children, is a little bit over 70%. We're at 75%. So we're doing well according to the national norms. So that information is included in your superintendent weekly board notes, and the website is updated. So wanted to share that with you this evening.
Thank you, Vince.
You're welcome.
And then the last slide just really highlights where we are with our current mitigation measures. We continue to be vigilant as we go through to support our schools and also our community, because I think that's important for us to continue to highlight. Tonight, this is just for informational purposes. This item does not need to be voted on. It will be voted on at our next meeting. I will pause here and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for that, Dr. Jameson. On to study items, strategic planning proposal presentation by Cambridge Strategic Services.
We're here.
We're here, yeah. Good evening.
If we could share the screen, please.
Okay, was it sharing on your end?
Yeah, Kat, I saw it.
Okay, I'm bringing it back up then.
Cool. There we go.
Okay, so let me know when you'd like to begin and when you'd like me to scroll, okay?
Yeah, Frank, can you hear?
I can. Thank you.
Well, go ahead and introduce yourself, Frank.
Well, good evening. My name is Frank Morgan. I work with Dr. Kastner as an associate with Cambridge Strategic Planning. I am a retired educator. I spent 43 years in public school districts in Virginia and South Carolina, including the last 16 years as a superintendent. I'm very interested in strategic planning because as a superintendent, I used it for both superintendencies to help me sort of get acclimated to the community and develop a shared vision to move forward. And it was also a great tool as we were coming out of the recession of about 10 or 11 years ago to again collect ourselves and look forward after a fairly difficult financial time, at least it was in South Carolina. I was also excited to see that you all had passed a $30 million bond a couple of years ago, and you're in the middle of a lot of construction projects. I have a lot of experience in construction planning, referenda, and also the instructional planning that goes with improving facilities so that the new facilities can be best taken advantage of, for instructional purposes. So I'm really excited about the possibility of working with you on a strategic plan. Kevin?
And I'm Kevin Kastner. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I retired as a superintendent in 2006. Since that time, I ended up becoming president of Cambridge Strategic Services, and I've probably done about 25 or 30 plans since then. Actually, I was in Texas last week in Texarkana where we were finishing up their plan. I'm also involved in several superintendent searches. I mention this because we have access to districts all across the country, whether New York and Iowa or Texas, the East Coast. So we have I guess, a familiarity of the issues that are going on in school systems as you come out of the pandemic. I guess I also have an understanding. My wife is the executive director of elementary schools in County, where she has 16 elementary schools. And I have an 8-year-old son that I take to school every day because we're still queuing as we're getting in. So as far as having a sensitivity to some of the issues and the report that Dr. Jameson just gave, that helps us when we're trying to work with school systems. If we could go to the next slide, please. Start with what do you believe? In regard for board members, the whole issue gets around what are your belief systems? And how is it that we know Edmonds was around in the 80s and talks about we know how to educate all children? The fact that we haven't, well, how do we feel about it? So when you're talking about your school system and how you feel about your children, your belief system needs to be about promoting the success and well-being of each child. You're a high-performing district, but you aren't necessarily high-performing with every student. So then the question is, how do we find out that we can reach out, create readiness skills? So the whole idea of your belief system drives the fact that even though you might be high-performing, you still want to try to get better to reach all of your students. Next slide, please. When you go into strategic planning, in addition to the timing being, you have a new superintendent, it's a time to maybe re-energize members of your community, but you're coming out of the pandemic. A year and a half ago, I was doing strategic plans in 3 or 4 systems, and we got shuttered. And all the work we did a year and a half ago, when we now recently have come back this year, we had to redo it. Because the issues facing school systems, whether you're talking about the academic achievement gap, or you're talking about the social and emotional state of children, you're also talking about a lot of issues that are happening in our communities. What strategic planning is about is engaging people, public confidence, finding out what programs and initiatives will help you even more so move forward, and what to abandon. So strategic planning, it's a good practice. It's a type of thing that as you build upon your 2015, 2024 pillars, that was good work. But now we're in a different context and time. Next slide, please. The issue of a triangle of support, everything about what we do in our model has to be about the school, the home, and the community. When you as a school board and Dr. Jameson as a superintendent work with someone with the philosophy of Cambridge, the board and the superintendent in essence are trusting not just something from a top-down process, but a process that actually is going to be involved with stakeholders throughout your community. The key to the success of our model is the fact that when the strategic plan comes back to the board 9 months later after it starts, you're going to have the confidence that this came from a cross-section of your community. You, as school board members and the superintendent, are experts, and you will find that what your community is saying is probably much of what you already know, but the fact that they become stakeholders and ambassadors, all of a sudden you have an increased capacity of your entire support system. The next slide, please. So why now? Again, look what we know about technology now. We've found by doing hybrid models, we are engaging more people in our communities than we ever have had before. When I do superintendent searches and we do a hybrid, we've probably tripled the number of people that participate in communities, because not only do we have people in the auditoriums, but we also have them online. Also, with COVID, we have new skills. We also have to deal with issues where some of our kids' attention span, as they continue to be on technology, we have to be mindful. We have to be figuring out how we can get them to the point where they're using the technology to all the advantages and being mindful maybe there's some issues, whether it's in the social media avenue where things aren't always done as the way they should be. But all this gets back to looking at a shared vision as we come out of COVID. And we aren't there yet. We still have a ways to go and looking at programs that are going to better address things. But we also know, and I think you would agree with me, we don't want to say, well, let's go back to what we were doing 2 years ago. We don't want to go back. How now can we move forward with a shared vision? So the timing of this couldn't be better for your community. And right now I'm working with 6 school systems. All the school systems are looking at things differently than we did 2 years ago. Next slide, please. The lines now are blurred on how we do school. Now we know that we can educate, we can have children do work at home where before they did a lot of work at school. How do we look at more of a blended model where we can do a lot of work beyond our classrooms and also do exchange systems of tutoring, support system, and actually giving our kids more chances to enrich themselves by different programs that we have. Next slide, please. Our process, there are 3 phases. The readiness phase in preparing, the design phase of the strategic plan, and the support system in the implementation of the plan. The first stage of it. Next slide, please. One back, if you would, please.
Nope.
Isn't there another slide in there? Okay, go to the next slide. When we do our strategic plan, the components of it have to do with beliefs, parameters, a mission statement, objectives and strategies. And then in the yellow area, that has to do with action plans. When we look at the strategic plan team, is 25 to 30 people, 50% of which are non-school based. When we go into action teams, we're going to work with maybe another 100 or so people, again, in school and out of school. So you're going to be working with well over 100 people, even in a small community as such as yours. And you take the convictions you have from your beliefs. The strategic plan is written after you do SWOT analysis. You looked at your strengths and weaknesses, and you try to find areas that you want to improve against the context of the people that you work with. And then you get to the point of developing something that goes beyond just the details to the roadmap that you work with the action plans. You have a detailed proposal. It has a lot of this, and I can come in and talk about this more when we get into questions. Next slide, please. This is what the action plans do. They go from your beliefs and strategies, and they get into the point of operationalize them and getting into the roadmap that you would have to recommend to implement the plan. Next slide, please. We've already talked in the beginning. We are running, we usually run a community summit and we engage your civic organizations. We also want to present in front of the board to be as transparent as we can so that everybody in the community knows this is an initiative of the board and the superintendent with members of your community. Next slide, please. We're skipping to implementation here. And the implementation, once you have a plan, you don't want it to be on a shelf. And one of the areas that I've brought to Cambridge is the fact that we will work with your school system to figure out how you invest in working with each of your individual schools to have them figure out how the plan is going to best make a difference with your children. We need to have accountability. We need to have indicators of success. We think we should be reporting to the board on the priorities that you have monthly. And after the strategic plan team meets and they get to the point of putting their plan to the board, we would want to meet with them a year later and have staff in a public way be accountable for the progress you've made. And then try to look at, well, what are you going to do different from year 1 to year 2? We would want to do that for each of the 5 years for the life of the strategic plan. Next slide, please. It seems that some of my slides have gotten in a little different order. I've already talked about design. Let me go to the next slide, please. Before we get to the point of taking your questions, Frank, why don't you just give a brief summary of some of the key aspects of what the Cambridge process does?
Well, as a superintendent, I experienced this model, or a fairly close approximation of this model. And one of the things I found that was really, really, really beneficial is the fact that it is stakeholder driven. And because of that, and because you bring a lot of people from the community into the process, you get people's best thinking. For example, if a strategic plan talks about mental health, having people at the table with educators and parents and families that have expertise in mental health is invaluable. If you're talking about workforce and college readiness, having people from post-secondary and the business community involved is really, really important. So it's the inclusiveness of the process really brings a level of thought to what comes out in the plan is unbelievably good. Another real thing that I think is real important about our process is that it's consensus driven. As the core steering team works, decisions are made by consensus versus majority vote. And we think that's really important because what it does is at the end of the process, there's a tremendous amount of buy-in in what's going to happen once the plan is actually adopted. And I think that engenders a level of trust in the process that I think is very important. And I think the last piece that Kevin mentioned was we do follow-up with you. Once the plan is done, we don't get on the plane or the bus or whatever and leave. We are with you during your implementation phase also to talk about how it's going. And we can bring a lot of suggestions because, again, we're working with a lot of different districts and get to see a lot of different things that might be of help to you. So again, it's stakeholder driven, which we think is important. It's consensus driven, which we think is essential. And we think at the end, you would have a plan that would have a great deal of trust from the community in terms of what's in it and how it would move your district forward.
The whole idea is excellence is never an accident. It has to deal with high intentions. Your district, a high performing district, has high intentions, but it also has to have an effort that gets into intelligent execution. I would welcome of, let's say, the 6 or 7 districts I'm working with now, talk to their board head, their board president, talk to their superintendent. They'll tell you that this process is enabling their community to move forward. It's involving an expanded group of stakeholders, and it's coming up with better strategies to better address the needs of the students, whether it's in closing the achievement gap, whether it's looking in purposeful ways of how you're going to implement new buildings and the structures in the buildings, or address a lot of the social emotional needs that are going on. So I'd like to conclude our remarks. You have the background of our proposal, but I also think I'd like to stand on our references. These are the people that we have earned their trust. And frankly, I think that they will tell you this process has been very successful for their systems. At this point, we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay. Strategic planning proposal presentation by Insight Education.
I guess Kevin and I will be leaving now. Unless you have other questions for us or you want us to stay.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for everything. Thank you for the thoughtful and thorough presentation as well.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Stricker, are you comfortable sharing from your screen?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Happy to do that. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Quick thumbs up if you can see my screen, the cover sheet. Great. Thanks, Katie. Thank you, Ed. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Stricker. I'm the co-founder of Insight Education Group. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. Looking forward to sharing a little bit about our strategic planning process and learning a little bit more about your district as well through the questions that you may have. Our quick agenda, I know that I have 10 minutes and then a 10-minute Q&A. So in those 10 minutes, I want to just share a little bit about our background, who we are, some of the strategic planning engagements that we have been working on recently, the methodology and approach, so you get to understand that, and the stakeholder engagement process that we use as part of that methodology and approach. A quick overview of the timeline, and then I'll leave 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end as well. So Insight Education Group has been around for 22 years. I started it because as a teacher and as a school leader, I was a little dissatisfied, quite frankly, with the quality of professional development that I was receiving and the alignment that as a teacher that was happening between coaches and teachers and the school principal. I was receiving quite a bit of professional development in my school district in Nashville and then Los Angeles, California, where I taught. I taught first grade and 11th grade in each of those cities, became a school leader as well in Los Angeles. And one of the frustrating parts was just the inability to connect the dots between what the district was really hoping to achieve, what was put on the shoulders of school leaders, and then what school teachers were being asked to implement on a daily basis in their classroom. And so we've taken a lot of those lessons over the last 22 years that are grounded in my experience as a teacher and a school leader, and tried to apply those to the strategic planning process where we hope to achieve alignment and, quite frankly, focus, so that we're not overtaxing a system, but we work with leaders at the district level and at the school level to still focus on innovation and innovative changes, but also to understand what's doable and what's implementable. And so you'll hear through the presentation this evening that my lens and my bias, quite frankly, comes from that experience that I had as a teacher and as a school leader. I later became a chief academic officer for a school district in Southern California and tried to really focus our efforts on a limited number of things that we could do, given the external sort of pressures that we were faced with from various stakeholders and from the state to improve certainly student achievement, but also just different messages that we were hearing. And so trying to filter all of that as a leader, I think is an important thing that we have to just recognize and name. And that's a big part of strategic planning, to make some decisions about what we're going to focus on and what we're not going to focus on, so that we can, in fact, achieve good results based on where our system is now and where we hope to take that system in the next 3, 4, or 5 years. So a little bit more about Insight. I shared a little bit of sort of why Insight was developed, my background. That first sort of row there talks about the fact that we're practitioners. So everyone that works in our organization has been a school teacher, a school leader. Many of us have district level experience as chief academic officers, assistant superintendents. We also have worked at the state level. And so several of us understand sort of what the pressures are and the policy implications of states that are pushed down to school districts as well. And I think that's an important aspect as we think about strategic planning, because we have to deal with those realities of what the state is requiring and asking of us, and what our local context needs, and how we achieve that balance. So that leads to this next line, the orange line here, which is that we don't have a prescriptive process. We have a structure, but we also try to really understand what your local context is and use that local context then to drive the process. And that's where this concept of a ready-made program or process is derived from. And then lastly, the green line here, just appreciating the challenges and nuances of what implementation really looks like and feels like. So knowing that whether or not we're taking on a small or large scale sort of initiative, a small initiative of implementing a new sort of improvement around curriculum, or something to deal with math, sort of tutoring, whatever it may be, or a large scale initiative such as a bond in which we're changing sort of the look and feel of many of our buildings throughout the entire district. We appreciate what that requires. And that requires largely some collaboration, communication, and just understanding again what the trade-offs are of decisions as we sort of work through sort of those processes. And so we bring ultimately this sort of lens around implementation and experience as teachers, what it means to have a new math curriculum that is implemented or directed by the district, moved through the principal level and through teachers, and to really understand what that requires, what that means, just as an example. A couple of recent strategic planning engagements. We're finishing a strategic plan with a neighbor of yours in Ferguson, Florissant. And so we have about 2 more months to finish that plan. We are working on the second strategic plan for Guilford County Schools. Dr. Sharon Contreras there, we were with her in Syracuse as well, just below that. We did 2 strategic plans in Syracuse and are working on our second in Guilford now. And then another recent engagement in Waukee Community School District, which is in Iowa. So these just represent a variety of school districts from size, location across the country. But again, I think speaks to our ability to not only understand local context, whether that be large school districts, small school districts, but also to really stay with an organization through several years, through several strategic plans. So we like to consider ourselves partners and sit side by side with you, really understand the nuances of those implementation challenges that you have, so that we can work through those with you rather than just leave a plan that we sort of leave and then move on to the next engagement. But we're really committed to that plan and committed to the goals and committed to the results that you get. And so that's our lens as we develop a strategic plan. And so looking forward to learning a little bit more about, again, your school district and some of your needs as well. As we think about strategic planning, one of the things that sits central to our concept of any plan is thinking about how we're serving the needs of all students. And whether you call that an equity focus or really just attending to any gaps that we have in serving all students, making sure that the voices of students, of parents, of the community, of those that don't have a voice oftentimes at the table, that voice is represented. And we use those kinds of questions in our plan and in our planning process. You'll hear and see in just a moment that it's a very stakeholder-driven process. But one of the things that you would hear us do is sit with you and understand who should serve on that steering committee or task force. Who are those folks that certainly are different stakeholders, parents, students, teachers, school leaders, business community representative, faith-based organizations, but also who are those folks that typically don't have a voice and who have not have had a voice in this process. And we work hard to understand that and bring those voices into this process, whether it be in the steering committee itself or in focus groups or in surveys. And so we use a lot of different mechanisms to bring those voices to the table. Ultimately, what we're hoping to do is to see the system through all of those lenses, as this first dot point or bullet point here represents. And I think it's those voices that help us see the system through different lived experiences that help us understand what our core beliefs are and shape those core beliefs, quite frankly, that drive actions, that drive goals of the strategic plan itself. And it's through that process that we believe we can serve all students in a much better way. So the next 2 bullet points just give a little bit of nuance around that, how we use an individual, organizational, and community reflection process that's embedded in this equity lens of strategic planning. So it's not just about looking at you as a system, but it's also making sure we're attending to all of the individuals in that system and the community writ large. For example, in Ferguson, Florissant, one of the things that we really tried to understand was the history, obviously, of that community. And we looked at the Ferguson Forward Commission report. We looked at the anti-racist standards that the district has recently adopted. We looked at their equity policy. And those were all foundational documents that the steering committee spent a good deal of time understanding and reflecting on, to really think about what our core beliefs are. Do our core beliefs change? What have we learned in the last 2 or 3 years in some of the ways that the pandemic has really shined a bright light on some of the inequities that we see across our country. And so those are some of the processes that we use to understand the individual, organizational, and community lens in strategic planning. Finally, this concept of just ensuring that all voices are represented through this deep stakeholder engagement is a pivotal part of our process. I want to talk just very briefly about methodology, approach, and timetable. So I mentioned earlier that we don't have a prescription, but we have a structure. This slide represents that structure. Generally, when we look across any strategic plan, and we do 6 to 12 strategic plans in any given year, and we've been doing that for the last 10 years of the 22 years as an organization. But we see very similar structures, right? We see mission and vision and strategic plans. We see core beliefs, theory of action, priorities, measurable goals, initiatives, and then action steps. What I think is important is just to understand that all of those things are critical to a strategic plan, but how we start to think about our roles and responsibilities within this framework. Is it the right time to change any one of these? So certainly our priorities and measurable goals, as we look at the center part of this framework, will change every 3 to 5 years. But is it time to change our mission, vision, and core beliefs? And we make no assumptions about what that time is for you all. We're curious to learn about, is it the right time to reopen your core beliefs, your mission and vision, and change those? Do you have one of those, or are you missing one of those components that may add value to your current thinking and your strategic plan? So that's the way we approach strategic planning as it relates to this structure. Again, this is simply a structure that we ground a strategic plan in, but the manifestation of the plan may look a little different. So each plan may not have, for example, a theory of action, if you find that distracting, or if you have one that you want to ground yourselves in. Let's use that existing theory of action and think about what we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years to change that theory of action or modify it slightly. The other thing that I want to point out here is that implementation and monitoring is a critical part of any strategic plan. So we don't wait until the end of the plan to think about that, but some of the questions you'll hear us ask and some of the sort of dialogue that we would engage in with you are, what is your current accountability system set up to provide? What kind of data can we look at that's visually representative that allows us to understand any sort of gaps that may exist in achievement, certainly in access to things like advanced placement courses, in teacher vacancies, how long those vacancies exist, the structure and ability of your buildings to serve your students, the climate and culture, the safety of those buildings. So we look at and then try to understand what data you have so that we can build a plan around that data and elevate early in the process any gaps that you may have in that data reporting process, and then just have a frank conversation. Do we need to actually fill that gap, or is that something we're going to live with and we don't need that type of data? But it's important to have that conversation because we know that measuring along the way a strategic plan is really critical, and being able to be transparent with our stakeholders, with not only the board, but also with the community writ large and with staff. So as any district representative or principal can understand, how should I align my schoolwork to where we are, not just this year, but this quarter or this month in our progress on the strategic plan. So that gives you sort of a nuance of this framework that we implement. This framework represents what the strategic plan construction would look like, but also some of the nuance around the process and some of the questions that we ask along the way. Our process, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's 3 phases: pre-work, design, and implementation. We use a steering committee. So I mentioned earlier that it's representative of multiple stakeholders throughout the district. So we would sit with you and try to understand who should sit on that steering committee. We have some recommendations from our experience to ensure that all voices are heard, as I mentioned earlier. But we also want to understand locally who we should be reaching out to. And once that steering committee is formed, then we work to conduct that needs assessment, look at quantitative and qualitative data, not just quantitatively what you're achieving, and but also qualitatively, what are people saying about their lived experience in the district? And then we use that information to design the plan in the second phase. And so that design phase follows very similarly that framework that I shared on the previous slide. We also use a stakeholder engagement process during that design phase. So once we have stable content, then we want to share that stable content with stakeholders and say, hey, do these priorities and these goals, do they resonate with you? Do they represent what you want to see in a graduate walking across the stage of your school district? And so there's stakeholder engagement, not just in one phase, but throughout. So we do a survey in the pre-work phase, look at lots of data, including survey data, focus groups in the design phase. And then in the implementation phase, we work with staff to understand what are the key things that we need to attend to related to implementation. How can we pace, for example, our implementation of any of these goals or initiatives so we're not overtaxing the system? I talked fairly briefly about stakeholder engagement, but this just gives you a little bit more nuance on the types of stakeholder groups that we like to survey or do focus groups with, the various tools that we used, and the different engagement strategies. One thing that I would highlight is we want to plug into the existing systems that you have. So if you have a parent advisory committee or a community advisory committee, a business council, those types of structures, we certainly want to plug into those structures. But again, we want to work outside of those structures and really push you all to understand who else should we be talking to? Who else could we be listening to think about what the priorities of the district are or should be relative to their experiences. Ultimately, through this stakeholder engagement, we want to answer that question: what are the hopes and dreams of the community? And how do we achieve those hopes and dreams in a very specific, intentional, and purposeful ways in your strategic plan? A little more tactical on the timeline. So you can see that we anticipate starting potentially in June. We would work with you, and this timeline can certainly be adjusted, but understanding that we want to try to get started as soon as possible and do the kickoff meeting once the contract is approved, and get that steering committee in place, do the needs assessment as I had talked about, and really start to elevate some of the major themes that we can then bring into some of the needs and some of the areas of strength. I would say that our process is also an asset-based process. So we believe a lot in attaching to the assets that exist in the community and scaling those assets. Where are we seeing bright spots at a school that we may be able to scale to another school, or in one classroom that we could scale to another classroom? So those are some of the things that we would look at as we synthesize major themes between June and July. That would inform the work of the steering committee to work through that process of drafting the plan itself and then doing focus groups with stakeholders. And ultimately that would lead to thinking about very specific initiatives and actions that would drive the implementation of the plan itself. So I'll end there and just open it up to questions. Thank you for the time.
Jason, thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate your philosophy on how to approach this kind of work. I see in the packet that you've got a couple of other team members' resumes there. Would you be our main point person? Is there somebody who is specifically assigned to our district? Should we work with you?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I appreciate the question. So the way that we structure any engagement is I would be your executive sponsor. So I will always be involved in this contract. You would have a point person who is a project manager, and that would be one of those folks that we listed in the proposal for you all. And then we also have a cadre of consultants and analysts who help do things like crunch some of that data, provide reports, do the final strategic plan, pull all of that information together. But it's important to us that you have consistency. And so I would be involved in the process from start to finish as the executive sponsor. So if you had questions throughout the process, you could text, call, email me. Your project manager would work with a point of contact in the district as well to, on a daily basis, weekly or monthly basis, whatever that cadence is, to really move the process forward and facilitate that process. But I think it's important that there's quality assurance. And so at any time, if you have questions that project manager can't answer, you could pick up the phone and call me. And so that's why we structure our engagements the way that we do. And the team approach, I think, is also important, that you have folks who, it's not just one or two of us, but you have a number of us who have different experiences and who are dedicated, quite frankly, to your project.
I've got a couple of other questions too. If others want to jump in, let me know. But Brandy and I participated recently in work with a consultant through our executive search firm, to find Dr. Jameson. That firm did a fair amount of community surveying at the point too. I recognize our community has been surveyed for title programs recently. There are a variety of of things that have happened. Do you how do you handle that sort of overloading of community potentially with being asked for information?
Yeah, appreciate the question. I think the first way I would probably handle that is want to understand what types of questions were asked in those surveys and how are they relevant to the information we're trying to seek and try to acquire through the strategic planning process. I think based on just your brief description, quite a bit of that information could be relevant to a strategic plan generally. I think there may be more specific questions that we would want to try to understand as well. But anytime, for example, that you go through a leader transition, you're probably going to get an understanding from the district or from the community writ large of what their sort of high-level priorities are, right? As you're seeking a new leader, for example. And so the first thing we would do is just do an analysis of that data and understand, well, what were the responses? How do those inform the strategic plan? How recent were those responses? How pervasive were they? How many responses did we get from whom throughout the community? And were there any gaps? And so that would be our initial approach. Then we would provide, I think, a targeted probably approach to surveys. So it's not just a survey writ large, but could we target specific stakeholders that we didn't hear from necessarily in those other surveys? I think the sort of redundancy in our process of surveys and focus groups is intentional as well, so that if we don't get the level of response that we want in a survey, or if the community has already been surveyed, we have that data, then let's rely more heavily on focus groups when we have stable content from the strategic plan that we feel like is a better use of folks' time to give feedback on. And so that's, I think, the approach that we would take and how we would philosophically think about, are we over surveying? What type of data do we have? Is it relevant? And where could we better sort of use people's time and request people's time, quite frankly?
Great. Just one more question at this point about the product. So ultimately, we have a strategic plan. I very briefly at the beginning of my career was a classroom teacher myself. So I have, at least had the experience of, in the couple of years that I was in the classroom, the sense that like, there's always, this is the flavor of the month, or, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do in the classroom, and, not always clear how this connects. I'm curious how you have seen a strategic plan be used by, classroom educators or building level educators in your experience.
Yeah. So I think one of the more powerful ways that I've seen a strategic plan used by the classroom teacher is at that level where, let's imagine that you're engaged in a PLC and you're asked to think about what are the sort of focus areas for your PLC. Certainly that we can look at our student achievement data, elevate some of the things that are going well, things that are not going well, but that in a vacuum, I believe is important, but insufficient. And so one of the other layers that I would add to that are, what are the school priorities? And if we're aligning then our PLC sort of focus and conversations around problems of instructional practice at the teacher level, at the PLC level, to our school level sort of goals, instructional leadership team focus, then that becomes an important guardrail and creates that alignment that I talked about earlier. Then we go one more layer up, right? And if the strategic plan at the district level has a set of guardrails and school improvement plans are aligned to the goals in the strategic plan. So for example, if we have a goal to improve reading proficiency by X%, then I would expect that there's a similar goal by school at the elementary level based on that local data at the instructional leadership team level around reading proficiency. PLCs then would use that as a guardrail to understand how are our third graders, not just third graders, but how are our second graders doing? How are our first graders doing? How are our kindergarten students doing? And what is our sort of pre-K readiness program look like? So regardless of what grade level you are, whether you're a pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade teacher, you're aligning your PLC conversations to that third grade goal. That starts with the instructional leadership team and principal level saying, as a school, we have to focus on this because third grade reading proficiency is a great predictor of overall reading and success later in our educational career. And the district saying, yes, third grade reading proficiency is one of our goals at the strategic plan level as well. So essentially, it's just a series of gates or guardrails that create that alignment. But being transparent and specific about that is important. And that may or may not be intuitive to folks, not because of anyone's fault, but just because there's so much going on in school at any one given time, or in my classroom as the first grade teacher, that that may not be the thing that's front of mind for me. And so I think that's the way that the strategic plan can connect to the teacher in a very concrete way through that intentional alignment that I just walked you through.
Thank you. That's it for me right now.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jason?
I do. I have one question, Jason, and thank you again for the thoroughness of your presentation. In describing some of the documents that you pulled together to inform the process with Ferguson Florissant, you mentioned their educational equity policy. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about ways that you weave district policies specifically around equity into the process and the product.
Yeah. So it looks different in every district. In Ferg Floor, the very specific way was that we looked at, that Ferg Forward report or commission report was important, but it was also several years ago. And so we recognized the importance of that. We read it as a steering committee and we talked about it. But then we looked at how has the community evolved, and that evolution has happened in lots of different ways. But in the school district, the way that it's manifest itself is through not only that equity policy, but a new set of anti-racist standards that I very briefly mentioned. And so we looked at those anti-racist standards and tried to understand, what do those mean? As a third grade teacher, what does that mean to me? As a social studies teacher, as a chemistry teacher, what do these anti-racist standards mean to me? As a school principal, as a parent? And we asked those questions and we elevated those voices in the steering committee. And it was through that meaning and sort of deeper understanding that we did two things. One, we better understood what the anti-racist standards were in Ferg Floor, and they're brand new, by the way. They were just adopted by the board recently. So there was a twofold sort of intention around that. One was to create a communication structure for those anti-racist standards and a way to understand them and make meaning of them. But two, then to apply those to the goals of the strategic plan. and bring meaning to those goals. And so that's what it looked like from like the equity lens and understanding the equity policy in FERG floor, but more specifically those anti-racist standards. That is not always the case. Not every district, in fact, very few districts, I would say in my experience, have something as concrete as a set of anti-racist standards. We typically see things like equity policies or statements, and I know you all have an equity policy, I read yours. And I think that's important. And I would ground sort of the strategic plan in that, but I would say very similarly to what I described in the FERG floor process, what does that mean to you? Not only as a board member, but as a parent. What does it mean to you as a student? What has your lived experience in this district been as you walk through school every day related to that equity policy? Like, give us some nuance around that. What does that feel like? And are we living up to the spirit and the hope of that equity policy? Where can we get better? And it's, I think, through those kinds of questions that we better understand, are we achieving what the equity policy is intended to do and drive? And where are we falling short? Not in a bad way, but just naming it, right? We just need to name what's happening. And I think it's just through that honest discourse, quite frankly, in this steering committee process that we get better, not only at creating a product, but we get better at improving ourselves as human beings, as teachers, as principals, as leaders, and quite frankly, as a whole organization. And so I hope that answers your question, but that's sort of the process that we would go through.
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Did anyone else have any questions? Thank you so much, Jason, for that very thorough report.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Best of luck in the process of selecting. Have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Okay, Chromebooks, Chris.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to join you for my Sanctum Sanctorum here, if you get my Marvel movie reference. So every year, the district purchases a number of Chromebooks for our students. This year, we are purchasing for grades 7, 9, and 11, as well as one elementary grade level set. The total cost of that purchase will be $124,575. This is a Sourcewell purchase, which means that it's bid for us. So it's one of those collaborative purchases or consortium purchases, if you will. So we are guaranteed the lowest price. This also includes the Chrome management tool that allows us to deploy apps remotely on the student computers, as well as change settings, set settings that are student appropriate, and allow our students to use their Chromebooks using our filtering from any internet connection that they have. Trying to think if there's any other particulars about this particular purchase. Oh yes, supply chain issue does happen to be in effect for our Chromebooks. That's why I'm asking so early. These Chromebooks are in the country, in stock, in a warehouse. So we are ready to go as soon as the board has approved this purchase.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions? And we are voting on that tonight, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I would actually like to table 304 and 402. That is the Apple computers. It's my understanding that we're going to table that to the board meeting at the end of the month. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. Information changed at the last minute, and I'd like to give the board an opportunity to have dialogue with me regarding that change.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to table 304, item 304, and item 402. Do I have a second?
When we get there, I don't think we need to do it just
We
yet.
have to wait to do the 402. So motion to table 304.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. 304 is tabled. On to item 305. Chris?
Yes, this one is actually rather exciting to me. While we're in the midst of a roughly $30 million construction and renovation project in the district, that that amount of money was not necessarily sufficient to cover all of the district's infrastructure needs. While we did spend a little over 4 million on infrastructure, there was still some that needed to be addressed that did not fit into this particular project. One of those key items is the heat pumps at the middle school and high school. We're estimating that in order to replace all 75 of those units simultaneously would cost the district around $1 million to do so, which is more than the operating budget can absorb in any one purchase. So I've been looking ahead and get these heat pumps installed sooner than later, and then that would put the debt on the operating side of our budget. And when the district did another project,
Chris, you're cutting out. We lost you a little bit.
oh no, okay, what do I need to repeat?
Just go back about 2 sentences.
All right, so what I'm about to propose will put the expense on the operations side of our budget as opposed to the debt side of our budget. And then if the district decides in the future to go for another bond issue that would fund a project, we could roll this in and pay off this particular project. In order to get this started, we have to do what's called a planning and development assessment or agreement and I've been working with Johnson Controls. And in essence, what I'm proposing this evening is the board approve a $25,000 agreement with Johnson Controls to come in and do the design and engineering of our high school, middle school HVAC system, at which point we'll have a designed system. And then once that system is designed, we'll come back to you with a debt instrument which we'll use to fund the project in the expectation that in the future, when the district seeks an additional bond issue, if the district chooses to, we would be able to pay this debt off at that point in time. Other than that, we would be making annual payments until that time. So this is an agreement that would simply allow the district to enter into planning a design agreement with Johnson Controls Incorporated. Also important to this is this will that it is a consortium purchase. That's very important because as a school district, we all know that our revenue streams are limited, and in our case, 80% locally funded. So we need to be as judicious with our taxpayers' funding as we possibly can.
I'm sorry, Chris, can you say that last part again about this being a consortium?
Yes. So when we get to the point of purchasing the equipment for this particular project, it will be a lease, but the leased equipment will be done so through the Sourcewell initiative as well, which will ensure that it's the lowest possible price that we can receive as it's been pre-bid as part of a consortium buy.
How does it work to have Johnson Controls do planning on a building that's in the middle of being rebuilt?
There will be a certain amount of coordination that will have to take place. The majority of the units are not in spaces that are being constructed. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Phasing will be important. Right now, it's looking like there's roughly anywhere from 30 to 50 weeks lead time on any of these units. So it's likely by the time we get to this project that the majority or the lion's share of the renovation at the high school, middle school will be complete.
Chris, can you share too what we allocate annually to replace the heating pumps as well? I think that information is beneficial to look at it across the multiple years that we're expending.
Yes, ma'am. So for this past fiscal year, once I learned that our heat pumps were end of life and roughly in that 13 to 15-year-old life cycle and right at the end of it, we've been budgeting about $75,000 plus an additional $25,000 in contingency in the event that we need to replace these units as they die. And as a point of context here, we've replaced 3 of those units already this year, just as they've died dyed in the ceilings. They don't tend to work as hard in the winter months as they do in the summer months. I've just learned that we're expecting 90-degree temperatures here in the coming weeks. So we're going to give these things a workout. People typically don't care about their heat pumps until they're uncomfortable in their spaces. So that's one of these unfortunate scenarios where this is not stuff that people are going to see, but it's certainly things that are going to make our learning environment more comfortable for our students and our teachers.
And I may have missed this, Chris, in the beginning of your discussion about this. The reason it wasn't identified as part of our current capital project is that these are replacements that are made fairly regularly, so it wasn't deemed something that needed to be addressed altogether holistically as a part of the construction project.
We did look at this in the grand scheme of things, but it didn't rise to the level of priority as did expanding our spaces to meet our growing enrollment needs. So it's not that it wasn't discussed or that we didn't feel it a priority. It just the expanding our spaces was a higher priority. And it unfortunately is one of those items that had to be pushed down on that list. That's a good question. Thank you.
I'll also add the frequency of replacement currently. And so in looking at the cost and not being able to gauge which pumps will go out. And so as Chris mentioned before, we've already replaced 3. And so within now and the start of next year, he could have to replace 4 more at the cost that he's already indicated, which is $75,000 plus the $25,000 for contingency.
Any other questions? Okay, and we're also voting on that tonight, is that correct?
On the planning and design agreement, yes.
Correct. Thank you, Chris.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, moving on to action items. Chromebooks, can I get a motion?
I move to approve the Chromebook purchase from Staples Sourcewell for the amount of $124,575.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. I'd like to make a motion to table 4.02 Apple computers to the next board meeting. Can I get a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. 4.03 heat pumps.
Motion to approve the project development agreement with Johnson Controls in the amount of $25,000.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Before we move into executive session, I just wanted to remind everyone that we will have a virtual meeting for our school board meetings because of construction. Okay, do I have a motion on executive session? One of our new members.
I move to enter executive session in accordance with section 610.021, subsections 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 13, and section 610.022 of the revised statutes of Missouri on May 5th, 2022, for the following specific reasons: identifiable student matters, personnel matters.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Can I get a roll call?
Ms. Withycombe? Yes. Ms. Tasman Ewing?
Yes.
Ms. Kaufman?
Yes.
Ms. Goldsman?
Yes.
Ms. Robinson?
Yes.
Ms. Herndon Miller?
Yes. Okay, we will move into executive session. Thank you, everyone.
How are we handling this? Or do we have a new link